Hello, Angela Austin again, and we're talking again about the human being spectrum, and we're talking about understanding people on the autistic part of the human being spectrum. And the topics today that we're looking at are the behaviours associated with the autistic spectrum part of the human being spectrum. I'm just going to say AS part of the HBS, so I don't have to keep saying lots of words. I think you all already know what I mean. So the common experiences of people on the autistic part of the HBS that cause anxiety, we'll be looking at those, and what happens in the brains of those suffering from high levels of anxiety and the effects of chronic anxiety. Because as mentioned before, using brain science has helped us to understand the world of people on the AS part of the HBS and helps us to find ways of helping them. So we're going to look at practical things that we can do to reduce anxiety. And these are some of the behaviours associated with the autistic part of the HBS. You've probably heard of some of these before. Poor eye contact, although it doesn't apply always to all people on the autistic part of the HBS. There's sometimes a lack of facial expression in people affected, and extreme or persistent interest in one activity or thing. We will go into that, what happens in the brain about that later on. It's very interesting. And the wanting sameness over a wide area of everyday life, not wanting change. We talked about that before, lack of flexibility in thinking and ability to cope with change, and an inability or lack of interest to play with other children. And the communication can be poor, the development of communication can be poor. Also being sensitive to certain textures and sounds and smells. That does occur in quite a lot of children who present with or are later assessed as having autistic spectrum. And things like tiptoe walking or other movement disorders, sort of looking through your fingers and watching your fingers wiggling. Not being a people pleaser. I know all children go through a phase of not being people pleasers, but this does persist in people diagnosed with AS. And the inability to sit and focus, to anchor yourself in space on adult-directed tasks, that ties in with not being a people pleaser, of course. And this, again, ability to focus on one task or interest to the exclusion of others, and to protest very vehemently if they're required to come away from that interest. There's also a lack of curiosity in new things, so trying to interest an AS child in something that you think is really exciting and new, and they are just not interested. So those are some of the behaviours that you will see presented. Not all of them, but you will see some, or maybe all of them. Other behaviours associated with AS are being able to talk at others about their favourite interest without paying interest to the other person. Now, this might remind some people of, I'm not being sort of sexist here, but men talking about football or cars or something like that. We all have these kind of presentations, but they are very noticeable in people on the AS part of the human being spectrum. Then they're having meltdowns and being at times totally inconsolable, which can be a complete puzzle and very stressful to those around them. There are, as we've mentioned before, stereotypical repetitive actions such as hand flapping, odd finger movements, which are called stimming, like stimulating themselves by doing these things. Taking statements literally is also very noticeable. I remember going to a restaurant with some people who had autistic spectrum daughter, and there was a program on TV at the time called The Bill. I don't know whether any of you remember that, but it was a police program, and this particular girl was very addicted to watching The Bill. It was called The Bill, and so Dad asked the waiter for the bill. The girl became extremely upset and said, "I don't want those people here shouting and kicking indoors." So that's an example of how, in her world, the bill meant people doing that behaviour, and she didn't want it. She didn't understand the other meaning of the word the bill. Seeing ordinary everyday situations and events from a skewed point of view, misunderstanding and withdrawing and showing levels of upset out of proportion with the cause of the upset, because simply misunderstanding what was going on. We'll go into more depth about why that misunderstanding may occur later. And the common experiences of the autistic part of the human being spectrum that cause anxiety, we've touched on these before. The lack of ability with social skills, the inability to be flexible, and communication difficulties. So anxiety around new social experiences and new people. And sometimes the people aren't necessarily new, but the child won't understand why they're there, why they've suddenly appeared, as it were, from outer space, and who they are and why they're connected. I worked with a family where a little boy who had a wide extended family would cling to his mother whenever aunties, uncles, granny and granddads appeared. He just didn't understand their relationship to the family, and when it was explained to him in pictures over and over again, and he had the picture of the relationship, you know, this is mummy's sister, like your sister is Claire, this is mummy's mummy, like mummy is your mummy. Was this little boy, particular boy, is an intelligent little boy, but he just didn't understand that social connection. When it was explained to him, he was okay with these new people. So new social situations, a sudden change, like having to go to the doctors or the dentist. You're there for a purpose, which isn't necessarily social, but it is a social situation because you are interacting with other people. And it can be terrifying for someone on the autistic spectrum because they just don't get the complexity behind why they're in a situation that is new to them. Misreading facial expression and body language. This is something that we don't necessarily think about when we're talking to people, but we're reading a whole thing. We're not just listening to their voice, we're looking at their facial expression, we're listening to the intonations, the tone of voice that they're using, the way they're being, and it can be easily misread if a part of your brain that is set up to do that particular skill isn't wired up in the way it needs to be wired up. But something can be done about that, so we'll talk about that later. As I've just said, language and tone of voice. It's really important when you hear people speaking. You can pick up so much nuance in their tone of voice, how they're speaking. If you don't understand this, then you become anxious, and the outcome of anxiety is often meltdowns and resistance to compliance and withdrawal and so on. In terms of flexibility, needing order in your own area of interest, finding a situation that's sudden or whether the change is imposed just gives rise to huge anxiety. And in communication, which is another area where the brain function of the affected person isn't working as it needs to get needs met, there's a broad range of difficulties from the non-verbal to the high functioning. The non-verbal will find that what people are saying just sounds like gobbledygook. It has no meaning until effective support is put in place. To the high functioning, because of the the lack of ability to read facial expression and tone of voice and body language accurately, there's often misreading, misunderstanding, which again gives rise to anxiety. And anxiety, as we know, for all of us, and remember I did say it's important for all of us to look at ourselves if we want to understand people with an autistic brain. For all of us, anxiety interferes with our ability to cope in everyday situations and perform in a way that we would like to perform. So the autistic brain will cause the person with autism to feel sometimes like a clever spaceman, lost in space with no clear instructions. So you're in the world, but there's so many things going on that are really difficult to understand, that you're just thinking, well, what do I do? You know, what's the rule here? There's a wonderful book called What Do You Do After You Say Hello? And this is something that applies to people on the AS part of the human being spectrum. You need the clear instructions. And if a person has no language, it makes them feel literally like someone lost in space with no manual, floating in the dark, terrifying. And no wonder that they feel anxious and have meltdowns. So think about it like that. Being lost in space feels like, which way do I go? What do I do? And how do I be? You know, there's just no way of finding out how to be and where to go. Terrifying, really. And how do I get my needs met? Not being even aware of your needs, but having them at the same time. Literally floating in the dark. And where is the manual? Well, there needs to be a manual, and we, the people who are supporting those people on the autistic spectrum, need to provide the manual. And we're going to be talking about what we put in our manual later. So who will help and how? All this terrifying experience leads to high levels of anxiety, and that's why we see the behaviours that we see in people on the AS part of the HBS. What we now know about how the brain works really helps us to help them. Since MRI and PET scans, we've learnt a huge amount about how the brain works. We still don't know everything by any means. All the mysteries of how the brain works are being uncovered every day. But these things I'm going to tell you now are just so useful to have in mind when you're supporting someone who is on the autistic part of the HBS. So this is what happens in the brains of those suffering from high levels of anxiety. It can be any human being. This is human being spectrum stuff. But people on the AS part of it need more support, more understanding, and understanding how the brain works in the way that I'm going to describe is going to really help you to work effectively to support people on the AS part of the HBS. So the green bit that you see there, that's, I'm sure you've seen that in diagrams of the brain before. It sort of usually looks grey and crinkly, and it's called the thinking brain or the rational brain. It's where we store facts and we have rational thoughts about the facts that we encounter and learn. The lime green part is our emotional brain, and inside the lime green part, the red part, is a part of the brain called the amygdala. It's actually almond shaped, not that funny shape there, but it's called the amygdala because amygdala is the Greek word for almond. So the amygdala is like one of those radar things on a ship. It's scanning all the time, looking for trouble. It's also looking for pleasurable things as well, but it's also looking for trouble, and it's on the alert. And it's because our brains were set up to live in the jungle or on the savannah, and although we don't live there now, our brains are still working in the same way. And in a sense, although we don't encounter saber-toothed tigers around the corner or poisonous snakes hanging from the trees, there are dangers in everyday human life now that are comparable with those times. So we still need that kind of brain function. We need a brain that is looking for trouble. And then below the amygdala, you can see that the red bit sort of travels down towards the spinal cord, and on the way there's a part of the brain called the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is the part that operates our breathing and our heartbeat. We don't have to think about things like that. It operates all kinds of what are called autonomic systems. They're automatic. We can't live without them, and it's a really important part of our brain. But another part of the job of the cerebellum is that when it thinks that there's a saber-toothed tiger chasing it, or its equivalent, it will go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. And so high anxiety, when your amygdala starts operating at a very high level of stress, it will send signals to the cerebellum that you have to fight, run, or freeze. And we see all these behaviors in human beings who are in a state of terror. And we see this in people who are on the autistic part of the human being spectrum. Everything that we sense or imagine goes through the emotional brain first. So there's no such thing as objectivity. Everything has an emotional tag attached to it. And the amygdala assesses the level of perceived danger, as I said. That's really important. But when it detects risk, it does produce this fear, anger, sadness, terror feeling in 1/50th of a second. You don't have much of a chance. And your body chemistry changes so fast that we're flooded with cortisol and adrenaline. And it's exhausting when that keeps happening over and over again. If you can't manage that terror and fear that your amygdala is feeling and sending messages to the cerebellum, your whole body is using up energy to survive all the time, and it is absolutely exhausting. So the impact of anxiety on our ability to think clearly, to learn and retain information goes round in a vicious circle. So here we have an example of what our brain is like when we're experiencing low levels of emotion. So there's the bar on the side there with the red square. That's a low level of emotion. Everything in the brain is calm. Now the interesting thing to me is that between that higher cortex, that rational brain, and the emotional brain and the amygdala, there are lots of connections. And those connections are, you don't have to remember this, but it is fascinating stuff, and I think it's really important for you to be aware of this. There are connections in a place behind the eyes here called the orbitofrontal cortex, and that is developed as we grow through our interactions with our parents and our wider family and our friends and our teachers. And that connection between our emotions and our reason is always changing. And when we have high levels of anxiety impacting the orbitofrontal cortex, then those connections start closing down. You can actually see it in real time now, looking at MRI scans. And so it has been found that children who come from homes where there is a lot of order and a lot of consistency and clarity about and love intertwined with that, they have more connections between their reason and their emotion than children who are brought up in more chaotic environments where there is not so much consistency and calmness and clarity. And also it's interesting to note that those connections can, once you calm down, those connections connect up again, and you can start thinking more rationally. And you think about yourself. I can think about myself. When I get really anxious, it's almost as though everything is terrible. Nothing will work. It's all a disaster. And then when I calm down, I start to think, oh, well, I could do this and I could do that. And then I start problem solving. And that's, of course, what the rational brain does. It's a problem solving part of us as human beings. On the other side, you can see, this high level of emotion. It disables this disconnection between the higher cortex, the rational thinking brain, and the emotional brain. That disconnection causes us to not be able to think clearly, and we have all these feelings like anger, fear, excitement, love, hate, because you can, when you fall in love with somebody, it is like a bit of madness. It's got reasons for it, there are reasons for people falling in love and having these intense feelings, which are to do with nature, which we'll talk about later, but hate as well, the extreme opposite, and disgust and frustration. But if you're a person on the AS part of the human being spectrum, you spend a lot of time, if you don't get the sort of support we're going to be talking about, to be able to learn to calm down and to get on with your daily life. So we talked about that. It's a way of saying that you're disconnected from your rational brain is that it's an amygdala hijack. Your amygdala and your cerebellum, if it's an extreme situation, have taken over your brain. And there we are. You can't think straight. You're illogical. You're in overwhelm. You can't learn or study or move forward in a positive way at all. And this becomes a chronic situation for people on the AS part of the human being spectrum, because it happens a lot. And so it is a chronic stress. And it is for this happens to everybody, but on the AS part it happens more often. And what that does is create situations, that chronic nature of the stress, create situations where mental illness can become part of the autistic spectrum. The autistic spectrum brain is not a mental illness in itself, but if it is not supported effectively and understood, and we're talking here about understanding it so that you can be effective, then that chronic stress can create depression, such high levels of anxiety that you can't control your thoughts, feelings and actions effectively. And that leads to so many other difficulties. So here we are, this is a vicious circle. We have stress, anxiety, that impacts our relationships, impacts our ability to be social, creates all sorts of social difficulties. We're dogged often, if we're on the more able part of the AS part of the human being spectrum, we're dogged by perfectionism and a feeling that we're not good enough and giving up, and it's all a disaster, creating stress, getting anxious, being cross with people around us, and not liking people and misunderstanding people. You can see it becomes really a nightmare. So all of those affected by this on the human being spectrum, and particularly on the AS part of the human being spectrum, need to be taught and understand strategies for keeping their emotional brain calm and in contact with their thinking brain. The Life Skills, who are the organisation who are encouraging me to do this and supporting me in doing this, and I'm very grateful to them, they teach key strategies for everyone to be able to manage their anxiety and be able to connect more easily with their rational brain. And this the strategies that Life Skills use can specifically be adapted for those with AS brains. You can use them with anybody, really. But what is common to children with AS brains is this level of anxiety, and they need a low anxiety environment. They need a no blame language, which we'll talk about in greater depth. And this is a bit of a culture change for all of us, this no blame language. There is no right or wrong, and I can sort of feel you going, what? There's no right or wrong? But we replace that with there is only what works and what doesn't work. If you start to think about where has the concept of right and wrong, these judgmental words, where have they come from? Well, there's a long history of that goes back into centuries of conditioning for human beings. But when you think about it, when you sort of drill down, it's either something, a behavior, a strategy, an action either works or doesn't work. It isn't necessarily bad or wrong. So we need to change our language, because if you're a person on the AS part of the human being spectrum, you will react adversely to judgmental language, the judgmental language of right and wrong. I remember a boy was brought to me for an assessment to see if we could meet his needs in school, and his mum kept saying to him, you're very bold, Patrick, you're very bold. And poor Patrick, the more his mum told him he was bold, which he knew was saying he was wrong, the more excited he got. You know, he had an amygdala hijack. But eventually he did come to the school, and we worked with the parents, and they took on the no blame language. They gave up using the word bold, and he became a much calmer person. This thing about language is important. We do need consistent language around what's expected and what will work. Language, if you think about it, the words we use create the world that we live in. We also need repeated acknowledgement of our success, of what has worked, within a structure that we provide in the sense of the language we use. Because we all need to be acknowledged. We all need to be told that we've done something well. And it's very important for people on the AS part of the HBS, because they're not often told they're doing things well. And they need to learn to accept that and appreciate and feel good about themselves. Remember the human needs, self-esteem and sense of competence and confidence. So what do? Well, we go back to the brain. Here we have two sort of examples of different brain wiring. And what we do depends on what level of autistic spectrum we are supporting. There are non-verbal children with additional learning needs, and there are verbal children who have little connection to meaning and purpose in the neurotypical world, the world of non-AS human beings, plus additional learning needs. You know, they're bright children in one way, they can pick up things, but they make no connections. And then there are able verbal children who can make connections, but they have social communication difficulties and difficulties being flexible. And then there are very able children who have social communication and flexibility issues, but they're kind of hidden. You don't see them so obviously, but underneath that veneer, they are often suffering high levels of anxiety. So what practical things can you do to reduce anxiety? Well, there is this breathing exercise. It is deep and slow breathing. If we're dealing with people who are highly anxious, it's very important for us to feel calm. It's a sort of catching thing. Anxiety is a catching thing, and calmness is a catching thing. So if you're calm, it can create a calmer environment for the highly anxious person to calm down in. This breathing is breathing in for 7 and breathing out for 11. So you breathe in deeply for 7 and you control the out breath for the count of 11. Now I do say to people, if you can't do 7, 11, do 5 and 9, as long as you breathe out for 4 beats longer than you breathe in, because sometimes it's quite difficult to start with breathing in for 7 and breathing out for 11. You can move up to that, you can work up to that. You can teach it to children. I taught children who absolutely had no idea about the difference of feeling tense and feeling relaxed. The words meant nothing to them in terms of how their body felt. So we used to do relaxation in the school every day after lunch for 20 minutes, and we taught children about how it felt to tense your body and how to let it go and relax. So they could match the word tense to the feeling of being tense and relaxed to the feeling of being relaxed. We never ever used the naughty step, because naughty is a very judgmental word. The aim when you are upset and anxious is to calm down. So we'd have a place to calm down, a calming down chair, or if you're at home you can use a calming down step on the staircase. Muscle tension and relaxation I've just described, teaching that feeling of your body's tense or relaxed. It's absolutely key to being able to know your body and know what the language around tension and relaxation is. So there's a little boy there demonstrating very clearly what it's like to be tense. And one of the things I like that Life Skills teaches is shakeouts, which I use for myself a lot because I've got a back problem, and if I feel my back is tensing up, I'll do a shakeout and it just is like magic. It just frees up my back and the twinges I felt that are a warning sign just go away. So it is really about shaking your whole body. And if you listen to the Life Skills programs on the same platform as this, you will learn what a shakeout is like. And anyway, just have a go, just shake, pretend you're at a party. The long out breaths with children can be practiced blowing bubbles. You can make it into a game. See how long you can breathe out and how many bubbles you can blow. As I've said, use the calming techniques on yourself and teach the calming techniques to those who need it, and introduce easily understood clear rules and boundaries. Introduce the no blame language and the concept of choice to promote responsibility. Now that is a very interesting one, because if you are in your emotional brain and you calm down but you're still feeling you don't want to do what somebody's asked you to do, and you're given a choice to either do what they've asked you and have something you like, or not in a cross voice, not do what they've asked you to do and not have something you like, you have to go into your neocortex to make that choice. So those connections I told you about, which are here behind the eyes, the orbitofrontal cortex, they'll start opening up again and access to the rational brain will improve. So choice is a really important part of what we're going to be talking about, making choices. And use teamwork. We'll be talking about that in a bit more detail. The team has to be playing the same game with agreed and adhered to structures and language. Very, very important. Teamwork is very powerful. And use the 5 C's approach to autism, but it works for all human beings. And that is commitment, calmness, clarity, consistency, and choice. So in summary, today we've looked at the behaviours associated with the autistic part of the human being spectrum, the common experiences of people on the AS part of the HBS that cause anxiety, what happens in the brain to those suffering from high levels of anxiety and the effects of chronic anxiety, and what practical things you can do to reduce anxiety. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope you'll all go home now and practice some 7-11 breathing and tensing and relaxing your muscles and really noticing how much better it feels when you are calmer. Thank you very much.